accepted the responsibility to protect.
On atrocity prevention.
Words kill.
All societies are potentially vulnerable.
Atrocity crimes.
Timely and appropriate action.
Welcome to Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention by the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. I'm Jacqueline Streitfeld Hall, Deputy Executive Director at the Global Center. This podcast features one-on-one conversations with practitioners from the fields of human rights, conflict prevention, and atrocity prevention. These conversations will give us a glimpse of the personal and professional side of how practitioners approach human rights protection and atrocity prevention, allowing us to explore challenges, identify best practices, and share lessons learned on how we can protect populations more effectively. Today I'm joined by Bushra Khalidi, Policy Lead in the Occupied Palestinian Territory for Oxfam, based in the occupied West Bank. Bushra has spent over a decade working on advocacy, campaigns, and humanitarian policy in this field. Thank you for joining us today, Bushra.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
To start, as a Palestinian yourself, the work you do and the reality you live in are not separate. You're both a humanitarian and a Palestinian living under occupation. How did you decide to get into this field of work, and how has your own reality shaped the way you approach it?
Thanks for having me. Thanks for speaking with me today, especially on this day specifically. I think it's quite a historical day for Palestine, potentially not in a good way. But I'm Palestinian. I'm originally from Jerusalem. I work in and live in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, and I've worked in humanitarian policy for over a decade now. And before that, I was a public law kind of attorney. And I think like many Palestinians that are in this line of work, I really ended up doing this because the personal and the professional, like you say, are really impossible to separate. You can't grow up and live under Israeli military occupation and not understand on a visceral level how the structures of power work and how laws here are selectively applied and how rights can be denied in extremely mundane everyday ways. And that can be from my simple movement from one city to the other. It can be my access to my land, which is, about 45 minutes away. Sometimes I can't access it because of Israeli military checkpoints. It's about water, where we don't have control or access to water in the same way that settlers and settlements do, that are literally a 10-minute drive from where I am right now. And from residency, from permits, from everything. And so, and then you see those same systems escalate into mass violence and atrocity crimes and genocide. And so in my job with Oxfam, I really worked on everything from humanitarian access into Gaza to the legal frameworks of occupation to advocacy with governments and the United Nations, really trying to ensure that Palestinians are not just a humanitarian caseload, but, we're holders of rights. And trying honestly to just inject some truth into so many of the decision-making spaces where Palestinians most of the time are almost always absent. And so I think that's the common thread maybe in all of my work. I'm trying to close this massive gap between what Palestinians experience every day and the sanitized way our lives are talked about in diplomatic rooms.
In May of this year, you published a piece on Israeli occupation, sharing the experience of your home in the Old City being repeatedly taken by settlers and your family-in-law in Gaza enduring the cruel, drawn-out effects of the Israeli-made famine. Reflecting on what you just said, can you share with our audience on how Israel's occupation as a root cause has failed to be acted on as an early warning sign, and how it has become even more entrenched as a result of that?
I think on this question, and maybe we can talk a little more, but from my perspective, the way this has become entrenched is the dehumanization and the erasure of Palestinians. One of the biggest challenges that we're confronted with And I'm sitting and saying this to you, from someone who has sat in so many UN rooms, donor meetings, embassy briefings. From my perspective, the main problem is the narrative problem. Palestinians are just constantly erased. We're erased from the story, we're erased from the language, we're erased from the political analysis, we're erased from the so-called solutions, we're erased from the rooms where decisions are being made about our very future. And even like I think Gaza, the way kind of also it's been spoken about, sometimes it could, for somebody that's not very familiar, could sound like it's a natural disaster. People say the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and the same way you talk about, like, I don't know, a hurricane or an earthquake. But Gaza is not a natural disaster. It's literally the result of deliberate policies and political choices. And so, whenever you're removing the political and the legal context, you're just ending up with this conversation that sounds very neutral, but it's so deeply misleading. You're hearing language like renewed hostilities, or it's a complex environment, or we're having access challenges. I saw even a title of a piece in the Nation last week, registration obstacles. As if we're like describing a traffic jam, not a siege that's been enforced by Israel for more than 18 years and now has, forcibly and massively displaced the entire population and starved it. And so maybe the most painful part for me is the way Palestinian voices are completely sidelined. There's this constant sense that the world is talking about us without talking to us. And even in humanitarian coordination spaces, I'd say Palestinian expertise is just an afterthought. Like all of the water and civil engineers in Gaza, that they know how to rebuild Gaza. 80% of Gazan adults have a first degree. They are experienced, educated people who, and they're not even in the room when people are talking about recovery and reconstruction effort. And that's absurd, because Palestinians are the ones that are at the forefront. They're the ones that are responding on the ground. Whether you're talking about the local partners that we support, the community networks that we support, the volunteer medics and nurses that you saw. I mean, we saw about a cohort of 90 doctors and nurses graduating during the genocide because of their volunteering work in hospitals over the last 2 years. The engineers, like I said, that are keeping, the water systems running with zero resource and zero materials. So, resisting this erasure, it's also part of our job as humanitarians, and making sure that occupation is not entrenched through the erasure of Palestinians. So I think naming things accurately has been a massive part of our job in the last 2 years as well. We have to always bring context back into the conversation. That's also part of our mandate in the last 2 years, because if you remove the context, then there's no accountability. And so without accountability, genocide, atrocities, and occupation just continues.
Absolutely. And, as we've seen in Gaza and elsewhere in occupied territory, Israel has distorted international law. And so I'm wondering, how has Israel distorted international humanitarian law in particular and instrumentalized humanitarian aid to serve as a cover for its commission of atrocities?
I think in order to understand the crisis, you need to understand Israeli policies and the structural violence that's behind this crisis. And so when we talk about Gaza or the West Bank or East Jerusalem, we have to zoom out, because none of this started yesterday. We're dealing with a very systematic, very intentional, and deliberate architecture of control in the West Bank today. Settlements are expanding at a pace that we've never seen. Land registration processes under Israeli law are being used to annex territory and steal Palestinian land. I mean, quite broad, clear terms. And that's, and they're doing so in practice, not yet in name, because they don't have a law of annexation yet, but they're on their way to that. Palestinians like me, I live under military law. The settler that lives right 1.5 kilometers away from me, which is like I said, 10-15 minute drive. We have a settlement right here, Beit Il. It's right behind me. They live under civilian law. I live under military law. They live under civilian law. And settler violence right now as well across the West Bank is being used as a method by the state itself, is being used as a method of territorial expansion and annexation. And then our movement is completely controlled through a permit regime that governs everything. It governs us going to school, accessing hospitals, accessing our land to pick olives. The permit regime really governs our lives and our entire freedom of movement. So these are not isolated incidents, These are features of a system that most human rights organizations in the world, including Israeli ones, have described as apartheid. And Gaza is part of that system. It's governed through separation. It's governed through a blockade. It's governed through restrictions on people's movement and restrictions on the goods that enter and that leave Gaza. There's no access to air and sea because Israel controls the sea space and the airspace in Gaza and controls the crossings into Gaza. I mean, today they'll tell you, oh, we've got, three crossings open. Well, actually, what they're not telling you when the three crossings open is two of them are alternating between one another. So when one is closed, the other one open. Why? You have 7 crossings into Gaza. Why aren't only 3 and 2 alternating? So when violence, is escalating, as we like to describe it, all these underlying structures, they basically snap into place. Civilians have nowhere to go, nowhere safe to go. Infrastructure has already been degraded, has been maybe potentially all demolished. Humanitarian access is completely restricted, if not blocked completely. And the populations in Gaza are extremely vulnerable. And so that's why we're seeing catastrophic levels of displacement, of starvation, and destruction now. Because the foundations before the 6th, 7th of October 2023 were already weak because it was made weak by design. And so I want to stress something that we can't talk about preventing atrocities, preventing genocide without talking about these structures. Because atrocity crimes and genocide, they don't just appear or emerge in a vacuum. They emerge from a sustained systems of inequality, of dehumanization, and of impunity. And that's why we're here today.
2 different questions I want to ask you in response to that. But I'll start with, as someone who obviously is an intimate experience of the situation in Palestine, but is, very broadly an expert on IHL and humanitarian law from your work, what are the broader implications of what's happening on the integrity of IHL and on the integrity of member states of the UN in their commitment to, principled and dignified provision of humanitarian assistance, principled, position on upholding IHL and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously something I've been so vocal about in the last 2 years is the weaponization of humanitarian aid and the erosion of international law, the gross erosion of international law we're seeing in Gaza. What we've seen in Gaza, like I said, over the last 2 years, it's not a logistics crisis. It's a political crisis that has used logistics as cover. If you want to kind of put it that way, our aid convoys are blocked. Fuel has been restricted. The list of items permitted inside Gaza has been manipulated. Dual use items remains arbitrary, untransparent, opaque. We have no idea what the list is really, what can and can't enter. The zones that Israel declared as safe when they were throwing the leaflets on, hundreds of thousands of people all around Gaza, and then they were bombed, where they were telling people to go to safe zones and then bombed those safe zones and burnt people alive in those safe zones. And then humanitarian access that has been conditioned on political demands. If you do this and do that, and we'll slow down our criticism of Israel. That has been basically the narrative, where actually humanitarian access should have nothing to do with your political negotiations on the ceasefire. And so this is the inversion of international humanitarian law in Gaza. IHL is supposed to protect civilians. It requires the parties to the conflict to facilitate aid. It prohibits starvation as a method of warfare. International humanitarian law prohibits forced displacement. But instead, all we have seen is active aid obstruction and even intentional aid obstruction, where we've had, convoys clearly marked, clearly coordinated, clearly deconflicted by Israeli authorities and then bombed and then aid workers killed. We've had the politicization of access, where, we've been told as a UN or a humanitarian country team that we're lazy, that we're inefficient, that we don't know how to do our work. And then we've had humanitarian aid used as leverage, where the EU in July said, oh, well, if Israel doesn't improve access, then, it's going to get a really bad slap on its hands. I mean, that conversation shouldn't even have been had in the first place. And so, frankly, it's a global system that's allowed this to happen. And then we have the question of third states, like states that have continued to transfer weapons in a context where they know, or at least should know, that they may be used in violations and war crimes. And states have refused to use their political leverage. And states have treated Palestinian civilian death as collateral, as inevitable, as something abstract. And that's outrageous. And I want to be very clear, because this isn't a failure of information. God knows how many briefings I've shared to capitals in the last 2 years. No one knows what's happening. Nobody can pretend they don't know what's happening in Gaza. It's really a failure of political will that we've seen in the last 2 years in Gaza.
I agree entirely. And I want to pick up on something you just said, which is, you've been doing a ton of briefings. You said that you've been arguing many of these points for the last 2 years. And I think there's often a misconception that humanitarian organizations must remain silent, and particularly on root causes, in order to maintain neutrality, or that they cannot speak on justice or accountability. In Occupied Palestinian Territory, Oxfam has been providing life-saving assistance while also mobilizing campaigns to ban trade with illegal settlements, calling for global intervention to stop Israel's genocide, including through arms embargoes. So, as a humanitarian, how do you define neutrality, and how do you view the role of humanitarians in crises where atrocities are also being committed?
I think first I want to say that what humanitarian organizations have done in Gaza and are doing, honestly, it's heroic work. Seeing my colleagues deliver under fire in the last 2 years and continuing to do so, it's been the most inspiring to see, as for me as a humanitarian. But we need to also, be honest with ourselves, because our job is not only to deliver food boxes and water, it's also to uphold these principles under international humanitarian law. So, and I'll speak maybe to neutrality a little bit, but I just want to talk about like kind of what we are supposed to do in terms of our principles, broadly speaking, in these atrocity contexts like Gaza. We have to, one, speak very clearly, because we can't euphemize or water down, starvation of mass displacement. Mass displacement. Language matters so much. We also have an obligation to bear witness. We have to document and we have to communicate what we see. If my colleague is killed in an Israeli airstrike, should I not be telling my donor that happened? Should I not be telling my donor that my truck is unable to enter because Israel is blocking it because it thinks that water purification tablets is a dual use item, or that baby farm formula is a dual use item? I have to speak clearly and bear witness and challenge those structures, right? And so I not only do I document and communicate what I see, and this is not just a needs assessment of the population that we serve, but we need to also document the pattern of violations, and we have to challenge these structures and not just the symptoms of the structures. So if I'm only talking about my trucks and convoys and the aid, we also become complicit in this narrative that this is a technical crisis and it needs a logistical solution. We have to also support Palestinian agency, because that's so critical. Palestinians are not passive recipients of aid. They're leading in their communities, They're rebuilding the water systems with nothing. They're growing with nothing. I saw yesterday a crop of zucchini in Gaza. They're running shelters. They're running clinics. They're organizing distribution networks. And so everything we do should amplify and not replace that leadership. And so, humanitarian responses should never depoliticize a people. It has to protect their rights. And then, in terms of neutrality in the humanitarian sense, from our perspective, Oxfam, that's not necessarily actually a principle that we abide by in the way that it's understood. And we prefer talking about impartiality, but neutrality. And that's our interpretation at Oxfam. But also, I've spoken a lot about that in the last 2 years. It doesn't mean silence. It doesn't mean that you have to pretend that both sides are the same. And it absolutely does not mean that you avoid the truth. Neutrality actually means that humanitarian actors that are not part or don't take part in the hostilities and don't align themselves to any specific party to the conflict. It means that our aid is guided by what people need and what rights people have, not by political loyalty. And so we treat people based on humanitarian principles of humanity, of impartiality, of independence, and neutrality. But neutrality often it's understood like symmetry, but it's not the same thing as symmetry. It doesn't require me to describe an asymmetric situation as if it were equal. That's not what neutrality means. And it doesn't require me to ignore the legal status of occupation that the ICJ clearly said that is unlawful. And it doesn't require me to downplay violations or to pretend that Palestinian civilians are not being harmed by identifiable policies of collective punishment, of siege, of forcible displacement. So neutrality really requires us to be honest. And so if access is being blocked, we say it. And if civilians are being forcibly displaced, we say it. And if a party is violating international humanitarian law, we say it, no matter who the party is, without fear of naming the facts, and without fear that naming those facts would be perceived as us taking sides. Because you can't be neutral if you're not honest and if you're not truthful. So for me, neutrality is very simple. We stand with civilians, we stand with international law, and we stand with the humanitarian imperative, not with the politics of any armed actor, whether that's Hamas, whether that's Israel, whether any other armed group. And so when we speak the truth and the honest truth about what we're seeing on the ground and the violations, and if that is portrayed as us taking sides, from my perspective, that tells you more about the politics around us than about our principles.
As an outsider, I can say that over the last 2 years, we've definitely seen the ways that humanitarians have stood with civilians, stood with international law over the last 2 years. I think I don't have the exact data in front of me, but I'm pretty sure that this is the situation with the highest number of humanitarians targeted and killed in the time that we've been monitoring atrocities over the last 15 years. And whenever we talk to humanitarians, when they are speaking out, it's never from a place of like, we're under attack and more needs to be done to protect us. It's always about like, we were there because of the civilians. We need to stay there because of the civilians. We don't want to leave, even though we're under attack. And I think it's really, as you said, heroic work happening. To pivot a little from kind of the humanitarian conversation, earlier you mentioned the settler violence, and even before October 2023, there was a sharp rise in attacks by Israeli settlers. These attacks are often taking place in the presence of or with the protection of and support of Israeli forces. In the West Bank, how does the relationship between settler violence and state policy play out?
Okay, before 7th of October, we had settler violence and we had record years of settler violence, but the way we're seeing it, it's now not really happening in a vacuum or in kind of isolated incidents. It's really happening in this very particular ecosystem where the Israeli army or the Israeli military and the state and the settlers are functioning in kind of a mutually reinforcing way. And there are kind of three layers to this relationship. So when settlers attack Palestinian communities, they burn their homes, they uproot their trees, they storm their villages. The army is almost always present. Okay. And of course the role of the army in those moments not neutral. They're not, what we're consistently seeing is, soldiers standing by. They're not intervening to stop the attacks, or even soldiers, they're actively facilitating the violence by blocking Palestinian movement. So they'll put a checkpoint, or they'll start firing tear gas or rubber bullets at the Palestinians who are trying to, defend their homes or their olive trees. So the message in that scenario is very clear. Settlers have complete freedom and Palestinians don't. And then there's another layer, is that Israeli settlers live under Israeli civil law and Palestinians live under military law. So it means that when in a situation of a confrontation between a settler and a Palestinian, that settler is going to have due process rights. He's going to have independent courts. He's going to have legal protection. And he's going to have probably political representation, because Ben Gvir and Smotrich are leaders of the settler community and are now kind of at the head of the state. And Palestinians have none of that. We don't have due process rights. We don't have independent courts. We have military courts run by the Israeli army. We are often 90% of the time not allowed legal counsel. And of course, no political representation. So even when settlers are documented, for example, attacking Palestinians on video, the chances of accountability are almost zero, really. But meanwhile, the Palestinian that is defending his land, he can be arrested there and then under military order, and he can be tried in a military court, and he could be detained indefinitely under administrative charge. And so this legal duality is creating complete impunity for the settlers, and of course is creating deep vulnerability for the Palestinians. And finally, often the way like settlers are described is they're like fringe actors, they're this fringe, radical, extremely devastating kind of group of people that are, kind of on the far right, but they're completely embedded in the political project of Israel's territorial control, because they're publicly funded, so they get massive subsidies to live and operate and work in settlements. They are most of the time armed. And even we saw in the beginning of the war, Ben Gvir arm 150,000 settlers across the West Bank. And they're supported by these same government ministers, including Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And also they're backed by very strong actual settlement councils and regional authorities that receive funding from, by the way, America, Canada, Europe. And so today, some of these most extreme settler leaders, they're ministers within the Israeli government itself. So the distinction between state policy and settler violence or settler activity, it's become almost meaningless. It doesn't mean anything at this point, because settler violence is often, or most of the time, serving a clear function, to push Palestinians off strategic land that they have their eyes on, as part of Israel's master plan for the West Bank, especially in Area C. And then that kind of those strategic pieces of land are then consolidated for settlements, i.e. de facto annexation. And the army's role is to create those enabling conditions where that displacement can happen. So the settlers act, the army protects them, the legal system shields them, and the political leadership rewards them, really. And Palestinians are left unprotected, unrepresented, and completely subject to this military regime that treats us as a security threat, even though we're the ones facing the violence. So this is why we always say that settler violence is not a series of isolated hate crimes. It's part of a broader system of dispossession. It's structural. It's not accidental. It serves a purpose, and it's deeply tied to the policies of the Israeli state.
And kind of building on that policies of the Israeli state side of things, earlier this year, the E1 settlement plan received final approval to move ahead, despite being long paused due to international opposition on how it would effectively split the West Bank into and isolate East Jerusalem. How does the E1 plan and illegal settlements more broadly serve apartheid policies and a wider strategy of fragmenting the Palestinian people?
Yeah, I mean, great question. it's a devastating plan, the E1 plan, and I don't think people quite understand the implication of it, because it's not just another settlement plan. It's actually one of the most consequential pieces of the settlement project, because it's designed to achieve something very strategic, which is the final geographic fragmentation of the West Bank, especially East Jerusalem and the corridor. There's a central corridor that links West Jerusalem to the settlements near Hebron. So it's to have one road. Basically, it's for settlers in the Hebron and the southern region to be able to be part of the greater Jerusalem. That is the plan. And so to understand why E1 matters, you have to see it as part of a wider apparatus of domination. It's not a standalone project. This has been in the works for years, for decades even, because E1 plan, I wish I had a map, but it would link basically the settlement that we call Ma'ali Adumim, that is directly to Jerusalem, and it would create basically a continuous settlement block that would stretch really deep into the West Bank beyond the 1967 borders, and would effectively, what it would do, it would sever the northern West Bank to the southern West Bank, and it would cut off basically Palestinian movement between where I live in Ramallah, and Bethlehem. And so I would not be able to go to Bethlehem on one contiguous road. And then therefore, because of that, it would then cement Israeli control over all routes to Jerusalem. And it basically destroy the territorial contiguity that is necessary for any future Palestinian state. And beyond that, look, already we're dealing with Gaza and West Bank as two separate kind of entities of the future Palestinian state. This E1 road would basically make it absolute. It would divide the West Bank into two. And so this is the core of fragmentation, isolation kind of thinking, right? It's creating these territorial islands for Palestinians while they're building uninterrupted Israeli control across the entire area. And so the area that's actually designated for the E1 is home to the most vulnerable of Palestinian communities. Their Bedouin and their herding communities, especially in a community called Khan al-Ahmar, and the broader kind of tribes that live around. They're called the Jahalin tribes. They live around Khan al-Ahmar areas, and these are communities. I actually was there last Thursday. These communities are repeatedly targeted with home demolitions and confiscation of their infrastructure, and they're denied access to water and electricity, so they have to pay for water that comes from very far away. They truck it. There's military zoning restrictions. I met with a Bedouin family last week. Literally, they can't step in front of their house beyond 10 meters because now the Israeli army has made it into around their home a military zone. And of course, settler violence and intimidation, right? So the goal is basically to make their presence impossible so that the area can be cleared for settlement expansion. And that's what we call forced displacement. And it's a hallmark of Israel's, long-standing policies of occupation, where they engineer demographic change by pushing Palestinians off strategic land. And we saw it in Gaza. We're seeing it in the West Bank every day. And of course, at the heart of all of this is Jerusalem, right? And Jerusalem is the heart of the political, of the economic, of the cultural, of the spiritual life of Palestinians. And so Iran is so important for Israel because it will help secure the ring of settlements around East Jerusalem, and then control over Palestinians trying to get into Jerusalem, and then the ability to basically cut East Jerusalem off from the rest of the West Bank completely. And this is part of its decade-long strategy to ensure that there's a Jewish majority in Jerusalem while minimizing basically Palestinian political and demographic presence. And of course, international law is extremely clear on this. Annexation of occupied illegal territory is absolutely illegal, because E1 basically would be kind of it acts like an annexation corridor. And that's why people say that E1 kills the two-state solution. But it not only does it undermine a political solution, it's also about removing the territorial basis for Palestinian self-determination altogether. And it will just entrench basically permanent Israeli control, permanent Palestinian fragmentation, and permanent inequality in movement and land rights and citizenships. So it's an absolute disaster. It's a keystone in this architecture for fragmentation, isolation, domination, and it's designed to split the West Bank and isolate East Jerusalem and dispossess these Bedouin communities and create one Israeli space where Palestinians are pushed into these enclaves.
I want to return to something you spoke about earlier, which is kind of the erasure of Palestinian voices, not just from kind of media and political narratives, but also from political spaces, decision-making spaces. The Palestinian perspective is so rarely centered in mainstream discourse. There's obviously also an element of dehumanization of Palestinians that happens in all of these spaces, and an attempt to erase and discredit your voices and experiences. How can international actors and organizations move beyond charity based, paternalistic approaches to the situation in Palestine and instead center and support Palestinians in their pursuit of justice, human rights, freedom, in their resistance to things like the UN settlement plan, and in reframing what needs to happen once the genocide in Gaza has ended?
Well, I actually think that if you really look at what organizations are saying and have said, I mean, at least those like Oxfam. I mean, I would use kind of an example of like Oxfam, like a similar organization to Oxfam. I think is many of them have and for a very long time spoken about the root causes and addressing the root causes and the key drivers of the humanitarian crisis, which is the illegal occupation of Israel and Palestine. But of course, I mean, one of the most painful parts of working here, and beyond the violence itself, I think it's just it is this systematic erasure of Palestinian voices. And like you said, it's not in the media, it's not just in political spaces, it's everywhere. Palestinian expertise is rarely centered. Even though we're the ones who understand the context, we're the ones who understand the law, we're the ones that understand the patterns, we're the ones that understand the lived experience. And for me, the erasure, it's not accidental. It's really tied to dehumanization, because if we're portrayed as, irrational and we're emotional and we're extremists and we're biased, then anything we say can be dismissed. And then if we're framed as, too close to the situation, then me, for example, somebody like me, I'm not then allowed to be an expert of my own life. And meanwhile, we see it a lot, and I've seen it a lot in the last 2 years. People that work here for 2-3 years, suddenly become Palestine experts. And that's an asset now. If you're non-Palestinian and a Palestinian expert. And so these people with no lived experience really of the occupation are just, they're treated then as neutral, technical authorities. And for me, that's kind of it's a form of violence, really, because it undermines your credibility. And so basically your political reality remains invisible. And I agree. I mean, of course, a lot of the humanitarian system still operates through a charity mindset. We give and you receive, and we save you and you thank us. And it's absolutely very paternalistic. And in the Palestinian context, I think it's also politically convenient, right? It allows the world to respond to the systems of oppression, putting that band-aid on the gushing wound without touching the wound, without fixing the wound, without stitching it up, without touching these structures that have created those symptoms. And of course, this charity frame, I think, especially for organizations that have just come to fruition and because in a context of chaos and need and emergency, a lot of new actors have come at play. And it becomes very dangerous, this charity frame, because these are organizations that end up depoliticizing the context and erase completely the root causes and basically treats us Palestinians as if we're passive victims. And then, of course, in an indirect way, it allows for international actors to feel, satisfied without, taking responsibility, because, we've given 3 million to the water and sanitation project to Gaza. So, I mean, there's no doubt that this sector has to fundamentally shift. I think many of our organizations are and have done that shift in a way where, for example, at Oxfam, we're a completely Palestinian-led office. You know, we just have one one international staff, which is our country director, but we're very keen on our operations being led, designed, and implemented by Palestinian staff. And so for sure, we have to reframe some of our work away from charity and towards rights, freedom, and justice. And I think Oxfam is definitely on that path. But for others, they when we say centering Palestinian voices, like, we don't mean we need a story of a Palestinian. We need to use the story as analysis, right, to inform our operations, so it's not like we're not trying to inspire donor sympathy by centering Palestinian voices. That's not what it means. And sometimes it's like that's how it's portrayed, but actually we have to use these voices as in a strategic way, in a political and a legal way, and Palestinians need to be in UN briefings and on these types of podcasts. And I thank you for asking me to be on this podcast. They need to be in the donor meetings. They need to be in the policy discussions. They need to be in humanitarian coordination. They need to be on all global advocacy platforms, and not as tokens, but as leaders. We need to lead the way. And when we are at the center as Palestinians, the frame will immediately shift from charity to rights. There's no doubt about it, and so I think Oxfam, we definitely do that. And we've been doing that for a very long time. But for other organizations, I mean, I would definitely ask that, they must stop hiding behind this technical language, right? So like, if displacement is forced, say forcible displacement. And if blockades is creating starvation, then say it. And if these kind of structures of oppression are shaping people's lives and the humanitarian crisis in the West Bank, for example, we have to say it. And when Israel is blocking aid, we also should be saying it clearly and consistently. And again, I think I said it before, our humanitarian language, it should not be erasing the political realities on the ground, because if we only say people need food, then we're helping maintain this system that starves them. So Palestinians, again, I think it's good to remind, Palestinians are engineers, they're doctors, they're women running entire community networks, they're youth coordinating aid under bombardment, there's civil society that are conducting legal analysis under genocide. They are legal researchers verifying Israeli airstrikes and how they hit specific buildings. They are experts who understand IHL, and the political landscape, frankly speaking, better than most diplomats I've ever met. And so organizations need to amplify Palestinian leadership and not bypass it. And we need to shift funding to local actors. We need to share decision-making spaces. We need to co-create strategies together, because we need to define our priorities. And of course, freedom is not charity, and freedom is not a food parcel, and freedom is not a box of flour. Freedom is ending the structures that are making Palestinians dependent on aid to begin with. And so that means ending the blockade, ending the system, the policies of dispossession, ending forced displacement, ending settlement expansion, ending Israeli military control, ending impunity globally, and pushing third states to uphold their obligations. The world needs to move from, how do we help Palestinians to survive Gaza, to how do we help dismantle the conditions that are making survival a daily struggle in Gaza? That is a question that we need to be asking ourselves, because aid is temporary, right? But freedom is forever. And so we have to recognize that Palestinians actually don't need saving. And by the way, I was in the field all week long in Jenin, in Hebron, in Bethlehem, meeting with communities that have been displaced by either settler violence or the military kind of incursions. And every single one of them said, we do not need saving. We do not need your charity. All we want is to return to our homes. That's all we want. We need our rights respected. We need our voices and our message heard. And we need these systems that are forcibly displacing and denying us our return to our home, and that are dehumanizing us. They need to be dismantled. So really, supporting Palestinians, it actually means supporting our freedom, not our suffering. we are continuing to rebuild, and Palestinians continue to organize, and we continue to resist, our erasure, and we won't stop. And this is why our voice matters.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Expert Voices on Atrocity Prevention. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or Spotify, and we'd be grateful if you left us a review. For more information on the Global Center's work on R2P, mass atrocity prevention, and populations at risk of mass atrocities, visit our website at www.globalr2p.org and connect with us on Facebook, Blue Sky, or LinkedIn at GCR2P.